Welcome to today's edition of our Casework Conversations podcast at the Housing Ombudsman Service. If you don't know me, I'm Sana, an apprentice within the Sector Learning and Development team, and I'm joined today by Margot Kilkenny-Brown, who is one of our investigators at the Housing Ombudsman. So today we're going to be talking about a repairs case that Margot investigated. It's a case to do with the landlord's actions during the voids period and subsequent repair. So I won't give too much away for now, but it is a good practice case, so stay tuned to hear more about what the landlord did well in this case. So Margot, I'm really looking forward to hearing more about your investigation, and thank you so much for joining me today. So that our listeners can get to know you a little better, could you introduce yourself and tell us more about your role at the Housing Ombudsman?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Sana. So I'm an investigator and I work in the dispute resolution function at the Housing Ombudsman Service. And being an investigator involves fairly and impartially investigating complaints brought to the Ombudsman by social housing residents. Before the Ombudsman, I previously worked as a lawyer in dispute resolution. And before that, I worked for the New Zealand Ombudsman investigating complaints across the public sector. So I have investigated complaints across a range of topics in that role, including immigration, corrections, police, and the transport sector.
That's brilliant. Thank you, Margot. And so super interesting as well. The New Zealand Ombudsman. I love how ombudsmen can be found around the world. That's something new I've learned today. Um, I've got loads of questions popping up in my head about the New Zealand Ombudsman, but I'll have to hold fire on those for another time. So yeah, bringing myself back to the Housing Ombudsman in an unusually sunny England today. Let's get into the case you've investigated for us here. Um, can you tell me what the complaints were about and a bit about the residents' circumstances?
Yeah, sure. So the complaint is essentially in a nutshell about the landlord's response to the residents' reports that their shower was not working when the property was let to him. And the resident was a secure tenant of the landlord and lived in a two-bedroom bungalow at the time of the complaint.
Thank you, Margot. So before a complaint becomes a complaint, there's usually a report to the landlord. Can you tell us a bit more about the reports that the resident made to the landlord about the shower not working and what the landlord did in response to the reports?
Yeah, so the landlord initially undertook a pre-let inspection of the property on 24th of November 2023. And this inspection report recorded that locations containing a bath or shower were checked for their electrical condition. The resident then moved into the property the following month in December and reported that his shower wasn't warming. The landlord responded to this report on the same day and identified the repair and attended to the repair within 2 days. The landlord also did further work to the thermostat the day following to ensure it was restored and fully functioning. The resident then submitted a complaint with the landlord. He said that when he moved in, the shower was not working, and while it was repaired the same day, he believed he should not have to pay rent for the 2 weeks prior to moving in and since the tenancy started.
Right, so we've got a situation where the landlord has inspected the shower on the same day that the resident reported it, and the landlord also repaired the shower within 2 days of the report being made, and a further repair to the thermostat soon after this. This seems like a relatively quick turnaround. How did this then develop into a complaint about the landlord? Could you tell me a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I would agree the time to attend and repair was relatively quick in the perspective of our complaints. The resident didn't dispute that the landlord had responded quickly to fix the shower once he had reported the fault. But it did develop into a complaint because the resident's expectations were that he thought the property should not have had any faults when he moved in. which is fair enough, but the landlord did explain the checks it undertook prior to letting, which was in accordance with its lettable standards policy. So it had appropriately done what it could do to check the showers functioning before the tenancy and explained that it could not predict that the hot water would be faulty when the resident moved in, and that sometimes faults do occur, randomly or out of the blue. And the report also clarified that the landlord was not aware or expected to be aware of any faults prior to the resident reporting it.
Right. So it's kind of developed into a complaint because the residents' expectations weren't really met. So could you tell us a bit more about when the formal complaints were made to the landlord and the landlord's responses to the complaint?
Sure. So the resident made a complaint on the 12th of January 2024 to the landlord. Following this, the landlord issued its stage 1 complaint response on the 17th of January 2024. And it said within that it had investigated with its voids team and ensured that the correct process had been followed in this case. It said electrical tests had been performed and no issues had been noted. It said it attended within its emergency repairs timeframes and resolved the issue in a timely manner. The resident subsequently contacted the landlord expressing that he was unhappy with the landlord's stage 1 response. And at this time, he reiterated his request for a refund of 2 weeks' rent. The landlord then acknowledged the resident's escalation on the 24th of January and responded on the 7th of February. So that was stage 2 of its process, and it said at this time that it had investigated the issue further with its head of repairs and planned maintenance and had confirmed its findings from stage 1. These were namely that it had checked the shower prior to letting. The landlord agreed that it was an unfortunate situation and empathised with the resident, but unfortunately these do happen. And then following that, the resident brought the complaint to us on the 19th of Feb 2024.
Right. Okay. So we've got a situation where the resident feels that the issues with the repairs meant that they should be due compensation for 2 weeks' rent. And then we've got the landlord's position that they couldn't foresee the issue and that they'd done the checks that were required under their voids policy. And so the case is on your desk for investigation. How did you go about investigating the case, and what were your findings in relation to the resident's complaint about the shower repairs?
Yeah, sure. So I'll get into a bit more detail for this one. So I initially reviewed all the information and evidence supplied. Then I would look at the landlord's policies and analyse the landlord's actions in this case against these. This included the landlord's lettable property standards, which requires it to ensure new tenants can expect the new home to be free of any unforeseen major repairs, and that all gas and electrical installations will have been tested and certified to show they're in good working order. This includes showers. And my findings were that the landlord took appropriate action in responding to the reported shower fault. It explained in its complaint responses that based on its inquiries, the shower failure was unforeseen following its voids checks. It assured the resident that it had taken appropriate steps to check the property before letting it and supplied evidence to support this. The evidence included an electrical certificate, which checked the shower's electrical charge. This evidence that the installations were tested and in good working order and in accordance with the required lettable standards. The landlord also supplied property inspection notes that were undertaken at the end of November before the tenant had moved in, where the landlord noted that it had completed repairs and replacements of 2 parts relating to the shower. These actions showed that it had attended to the shower, turned its mind to it, and they were reasonable and sufficient for it to take to ensure no repairs may be subsequently needed to the electrics or to the shower before the tenants moved in. And then the landlord's response overall was reasonable in the circumstances of this case. In addition to it responding promptly to the repair, it investigated the situation to ensure the checks had been taken to the showers functioning and that it was safe prior to the tenants moving in. This was appropriate evidence to aid our investigation and was reasonable for the landlord to rely on these checks. Therefore, there was no failure in the landlord's handling of the residents' reports that the shower was not working when the property was let. So overall, the finding was no maladministration in the residents' response to reports that the shower was not working when the property was let.
Okay, so that was brilliant, Margot. Thank you. So it looks like you found no maladministration in this case, as you were able to see evidence of the landlord carrying out relevant checks during the property's void period. The case also highlights the importance of good record keeping, and it sounds as though this landlord had kept quite detailed records that it was able to rely on when dealing with the complaint. Would the outcome of this case have been any different if the landlord could not show records of the checks and inspections carried out? And what would you say are the benefits of good record keeping?
Mm. Yeah, so in this case, the landlord had sufficient records of its voids inspections and repairs to enable us to see what actions it had taken in response to the residents' concerns. This meant I could easily weigh the evidence to make a decision. Where there is an absence of records, it can make it very difficult to make decisions. So, as to your question, if the outcome may have changed depending on the records, the outcome would have likely been different if the landlord could not satisfy that it had completed the void checks or the electrical certificate. In the absence of this evidence, we would assume that it did not perform checks and that it acted against its policy, which can be considered a service failure. And overall, record keeping is key to ensuring actions are recorded. It improves efficiencies, transparency, and it is essential in ensuring accountability for landlords. This is a factor that impacts a lot of our investigations. So if this is improved across the board, it would then have a knock-on effect, which would be hugely positive to the internal functions of an organization and also its general relationships with its residents.
Yeah, it's so important, isn't it, record keeping? And it has such a wide reach. It's not in just when it comes to investigation of complaints, but as you said, with managing relationships as well, it really does help to build that trust. And record keeping is highlighted in our spotlight report on knowledge and information management. Quite a mouthful there, so Kim for short. Um, Around the time the report was published, we found that in two-thirds of the cases we upheld about repairs, poor records and information management played a pivotal role in the maladministration finding. So, record keeping can really have a significant impact. Most of the complaint handlers who responded to our call for evidence said that poor records and systems were undermining their ability to respond effectively to residents, with these problems mostly occurring in repair complaints. In the report, we also highlight the importance of having clear information readily available to staff who become responsible for a particular matter. Like, for instance, in this case, it was probably really useful for the complaint handlers to have access to the electrical certificates and the inspection notes and records when they made their stage one and stage two decisions. And although the evidence itself wasn't enough to convince a resident of the landlord's actions, and they still brought matters to the housing ombudsman, it did at least help in the decision making when the matter reached, your desk here,
Mm.
and that decision of no maladministration. So, moving on, in this case, the landlord made good use of the voids period and carried out checks into the property whilst it was vacant. So I just wanted to kind of touch on that a little bit. And from your experience in investigating this case and other similar cases, what would you say are good ways for landlords to make the best use of the voids period for their empty properties, which may allow for a smooth transition?
Yeah, so I've kind of looked into this a little bit in some other cases on our system, and I've seen some other cases where the landlord has made productive use of the voids period, where there have been thorough inspections and it identifies repairs are required, and it completes these identified repairs before the tenants move in. And then other good practices can include where a landlord refers to its voids policy or its repairs policy to set expectations with the resident as to what it can and can't do. This illustrates good communication with the resident so they can know what to expect out of the process. And as you're saying, like staff, continuity between staff is also a really important factor in this kind of aspect of it to make sure that there's a smooth transition between people and things don't get lost.
Yeah, that's brilliant. Some really good ways of kind of making the most of the voids period there and some good practice examples. And using that time the property is vacant to address any issues or make improvements, it's something that kind of we touch on in our spotlight report for noise as well. And obviously this complaint wasn't about noise, but the report does highlight some good ways as well as the points that you've highlighted, to make use of that voids period with noise in mind, which perhaps our listeners might want to take a look at later on. Um, I must agree as well, managing expectations is really important and it can sometimes help to prevent issues from escalating further. So in this case, the resident had a clear expectation of the remedy they wanted, which was a refund of 2 weeks of rent. We didn't order the landlord to do this, did we? So I'd be interested to hear a little more about how we decide whether compensation is appropriate in cases, and how do you go about making those sorts of decisions?
Hmm. So yeah, that's right. In this case, we didn't order any compensation. So usually we decide whether compensation is appropriate based on whether the landlord is firstly responsible for the impact and then assess what the impact looks like to the resident. So the impact can look like their time and trouble in chasing the landlord for repairs or distress and inconvenience across the complaint period. Um, in this case, the landlord wasn't responsible for the impact and therefore did not have to fulfill the resident's request for compensation. So I didn't have to then go on to the second stage of analysis. But in situations where we may decide compensation is appropriate, we look at whether the landlord has appropriately assessed the impact and acted to offer compensation in line with our guidance and compensation policy in order to put things right. So what this looks like is restoring the resident to a position they would have been in before the complaint, and we consider if they've offered a reasonable amount for its service failures that they've identified. And if the landlord has not fully recognised the impact or put things right for the resident, we can order it to pay compensation or further compensation to what it may have already offered. And then in terms of cases where we might consider a rent reimbursement may be relevant as where residents the resident's use and enjoyment of a property is impacted, and that can look like where the use of a room is substantially impaired. So say, for example, if they've lost use of their bathroom and there's an ongoing toilet repair, they can't use the toilet, which is impacting them on a daily basis, then we may consider a partial rent reimbursement in those circumstances.
Right. Thanks, Margot. And I guess with compensation and remedies, it's all kind of because it's the cases, no two cases are ever the same, and it's all kind of decided on a
Mm.
case by case basis. But it's good to kind of have an overview of how you kind of make decisions in these matters. And if landlords want to know more about our approach to compensation when we make our decisions, they can find more information about this on our website. So, Margot, I'm afraid that's all we have time for today. Thank you so much for sharing this case with us.
Okay.
It's been brilliant. Thank you so much. And it's been really interesting to hear about the different aspects of the case, from speaking about the void period, inspections, and record keeping too. And we mentioned a couple of our spotlight reports during the podcast. So if our listeners want to read more about the reports mentioned in the podcast, those can also be found on our website. And before I forget, thank you to our listeners for tuning in as well. If you've enjoyed today's podcast, we've got plenty more of them available on the SoundCloud platform or through our Centre for Learning Landlord Hub. Um, there are also a host of other resources that our member landlords can access through the Learning Hub, like e-learnings, micro-learnings, and lots more. We're always updating, so please do check out the Centre for Learning Landlord Hub if you are a landlord. And if you're a resident or a different interested party, we have lots of information and resources on our website, which I should mention is www.housing-ombudsman.org.uk. So thank you again, Margot. That's it from
Thank
us to
you.
say.
Lovely speaking with you.
It's been brilliant, and thank you for your time today. Thank you.